You are nothing but dirt on my wedding dress, my sister screamed as she poured a glass of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon all over me. I sat there shivering in the freezing rain while my parents watched with satisfied smiles. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They thought the man driving the beat-up truck coming up the driveway was just the help. They had no idea that my husband was about to fire the groom and buy the very ground they were standing on. My name is Zara King, and I am 28 years old. To the elites of Atlanta, I am the black sheep of the prominent King family, the disappointment who chose art over law, the failure who married a man with calloused hands instead of a portfolio manager. But as I walked up the winding driveway of the Buckhead estate that afternoon, I was just a sister trying to keep a promise. The humidity was thick enough to choke on the kind of heavy Georgia air that promises a violent storm. I had to walk from the main gate because my mother Joyce had explicitly forbidden my Uber from entering the grounds, claiming it would clutter the aesthetic of the entrance. My heels sank into the gravel with every step, and sweat began to prickle at the back of my neck, threatening to ruin the hair I had spent 2 hours styling myself. The estate was breathtaking, a sprawling mansion with white columns that screamed old Southern money, even though the owners had only bought it 5 years ago. A massive climate-controlled glass tent had been erected on the south lawn. Inside, I could see the silhouette of the black elite of Atlanta mingling with Wall Street bankers. Crystal chandeliers glinted in the afternoon sun, and the sound of a live jazz band drifted out muffled by the thick glass. It looked like a page out of Vogue living a world I had been born into, but was no longer welcome in. I smoothed down my dress. It was a soft beige linen I had found at a vintage shop in Little Five Points. It was clean, modest, and elegant, but I knew the moment I saw my mother standing at the entrance of the tent that it would not be enough. Joyce was wearing a structured emerald green gown that probably cost more than my car. She was directing the seating arrangements with the precision of a military general, ensuring that the doctors sat with the doctors and the old money stayed away from the new money. When she saw me approaching, her smile dropped instantly, replaced by a look of pure disdain. She stepped out of the tent, blocking the entrance, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are late," she hissed, her eyes scanning me from head to toe like a scanner at a grocery checkout. "And what on earth are you wearing?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "It is a linen dress, Mom. I think it looks nice." "It looks like a tablecloth, Zara," she snapped loud enough for the greeters to hear. "You look like you are here to clear the tables, not sit at them. I told you this was a black tie affair. Look at the hem, it is practically fraying." I tried to step past her, reaching for the door handle to get into the cool air conditioning, but she moved to block me again. "Where do you think you are going?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You cannot go in there looking like that. You will ruin the aesthetic of the room. The photographer is taking wide shots, and I will not have you standing out like a sore thumb in the background of Bianca's special day." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. "Mom, please, it is starting to get dark and it looks like rain. Where do you want me to sit?" She pointed a manicured finger toward a small metal table set up near the catering trucks, completely outside the protection of the tent. "Over there," she said. "That is the overflow seating for the vendors and the help. You can sit there, and do not come inside until the speeches are over. I do not want Preston's family asking who the charity case is." I lowered myself onto the freezing metal chair which wobbled on the uneven pavers. The first real wave of rain swept across the lawn. It was not a romantic drizzle. It was an angry, sudden downpour typical of Atlanta summers. In seconds, the water soaked through my linen dress, plastering it to my skin like a second layer of ice. I shivered violently, my teeth beginning to chatter. Inside the climate-controlled glass tent, I could see the silhouette of the bandleader counting off. Smooth jazz floated out, muffled by the glass, but distinct enough to mock me. It was a soft saxophone melody that clashed violently with the low growl of thunder rolling directly overhead, shaking the ground beneath my feet. I reached up to touch my hair. I had spent 2 hours curling it carefully, pinning it back to look presentable for a family that did not want me. Now the curls were collapsing into a frizzy, wet mess. Water dripped from my nose and chin. I looked like a drowned rat, sitting at the servants' table while the people who shared my blood toasted with crystal flutes just 30 feet away. My instinct was to run, to stand up, walk down that long driveway, call Darius, and never look back. But I could not. Not yet. My hand slipped into the deep pocket of my dress. My fingers curled around the cold, hard edges of a small velvet box. It was damp now, but the treasure inside was safe. I closed my eyes, and for a moment the rain faded. I was back in the sterile white room at Grady Memorial Hospital 3 months ago. The smell of antiseptic replaced the smell of wet earth. Nana Rose was lying there, so small in that big bed, her breathing rattling in her chest. She had grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman with days left to live. "Zara," she had rasped, her eyes cloudy but fierce. "You are the strong one. You always have been. Bianca is lost in the lights, but she is still your sister. I promised your grandfather I would keep this family together. Now I need you to promise me." I squeezed the box tighter in my pocket, letting the memory wash over me. Nana had pointed to the nightstand where this box sat. "That hairpin has been in our family since 1890. It survived Reconstruction. It survived the Depression. It is our legacy. Give it to Bianca on her wedding day. Tell her it is the anchor. Promise me, Zara, even if she hates you, even if they treat you like a stranger, promise me you will try one last time." I had promised. I wiped the rain from my eyes. That promise was the only reason I was sitting in a puddle on a metal chair, while my own mother pretended I did not exist. I would give Bianca the hairpin. I would fulfill my vow to the only woman who had ever loved me unconditionally. And then I would leave. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the metal table. I pulled my knees up, trying to preserve a little body heat, watching the condensation fog up the glass walls of the tent, turning the guests into blurry ghosts of wealth and privilege. I was cold to the bone, but the fire of my promise kept me rooted to the spot. Just as I thought the cold had finally seeped into my marrow, the side doors of the glass pavilion slid open. A brief gust of warm, scented air escaped before the heavy panes sealed shut again. Bianca and Preston stepped out onto the covered limestone terrace that overlooked the muddy lawn where I was exiled. They were not coming to check on me. They were followed by a photographer and 2 assistants holding light reflectors. The storm, it seemed, was now serving as a dramatic, moody backdrop for their editorial wedding portraits. Bianca looked like a vision from a fairy tale I was never allowed to read. Her custom Vera Wang gown was an architectural masterpiece of silk and tulle, the bodice encrusted with thousands of tiny pearls that caught the gray light. It was stark, white, pristine, and cost more than my entire college education. Beside her, Preston looked every inch the Wall Street shark in a midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo. The velvet jacket was perfectly tailored to his frame, and on his wrist sat a heavy Patek Philippe watch that glinted as he adjusted his cuffs. They posed against the stone railing, safe and dry under the copper awning, while the rain continued to drench me just 10 feet away. The photographer snapped away, shouting instructions about angles and lighting. "Tilt your head. Bianca, chin up. Preston, look like you own the world." It was easy for him. He looked like he believed he had bought the world and fired its previous management. Then Preston's gaze drifted past his bride and landed on me. His lip curled instantly, a reflex of pure disgust. He nudged Bianca with his elbow, breaking their perfect pose. "Babe, look at that," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the sound of the rain. "It looks like a wet rat crawled out of the drain." Bianca turned her head, her perfectly highlighted hair cascading over her shoulder. She saw me sitting there, arms wrapped around myself, hair plastered to my skull, dress ruined. A normal sister might have gasped. A normal sister might have run down the steps to offer a coat or an umbrella. Bianca just laughed. It was a tinkling, cruel sound that matched the clinking of champagne glasses inside. Oh my God, she giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Do not look at her, Preston. She is ruining the vibe. Seriously, though, Preston continued, leaning over the railing as if observing a zoo animal. Hey, you. Yeah, you in the rags. You are blocking the shot. Can you scurry off to the kitchen entrance or something? My guests do not need to see the help while they are eating. He turned back to Bianca, shaking his head. I told your mother we should have had security at the perimeter. It brings down the property value just having her sit there. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, fighting the cold rain. They stood there dry and draped in luxury, treating me not just as a nuisance, but as a blemish on their perfect day. I clutched the velvet box tighter in my pocket. I would give her the pin. I would make her take it. And then I would never let these people make me feel this small again. I forced my frozen legs to straighten, fighting the numbness that had settled deep in my bones. I was shaking not just from the cold, but from the sheer effort of holding on to my dignity in the face of such naked contempt. I walked to the edge of the limestone terrace, stopping just inches from where the dry, covered ground began. I would not step onto their sanctuary. I would not give them a reason to call security. I reached into my sodden pocket and pulled out the small, worn velvet box. The fabric was damp and the gold lettering on the lid had long since faded, but to me it felt heavier than a brick. I am leaving, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the chattering of my teeth. I do not want to be here any more than you want me here. But I made a promise to Nana Rose. I extended my hand, the box trembling slightly in my grip. She wanted you to have this on your wedding day. It was her mother's. She saved it through the Depression. She wore it when she married Granddad. She said it represents the strength of our family, the strength of the women who came before us. Bianca looked at the box as if I were handing her a live grenade. Her nose wrinkled in distaste, but curiosity, or perhaps the desire to see just how pathetic my gift was, got the better of her. She reached out with a manicured hand and plucked the box from my palm, using only her thumb and forefinger, as if touching it might contaminate her. Preston leaned over her shoulder, sipping his scotch, his eyes mocking. Let us see the family treasure, he drawled. Probably something she picked up at a pawn shop. Bianca flicked the lid open. Inside, the antique silver hairpin rested on the frayed satin lining. It was not flashy. It did not sparkle with modern cut diamonds or boast a designer logo. It was dark with the patina of age, intricate and solid. It was a piece of history, a testament to survival. To me, it was beautiful. To Bianca, it was an insult. She stared at it for a second, her expression shifting from curiosity to pure, unadulterated disgust. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the tent. Is this a joke? She asked, looking up at me with cold, dead eyes. You cannot be serious. This looks like something you dug out of the trash. It is rusted, Zara. It is literally rusting. It is silver. I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. It just needs to be polished. It is an heirloom, Bianca. It means we are survivors. Survivors. Bianca scoffed, snapping the lid shut with a loud crack. It means we were poor. That is what this represents. Poverty, struggle, dirt. I am not poor anymore, Zara. I am marrying a vice president. Look at me. Look at this dress. Do you really think I am going to put this piece of corroded junk in my hair next to $50,000 worth of custom platinum and diamonds? It does not match. It clashes with my entire aesthetic. She looked at the box in her hand with genuine repulsion, as if the history it held was a physical weight dragging her down. I do not want your dusty memories, she spat. And I definitely do not want this. With a casual flick of her wrist, she tossed the box over the railing. It arced through the rain and landed with a sickening wet plop in the thick mud puddle gathered at my feet. The box sprang open, and the silver hairpin slid out, half burying itself in the brown sludge. Oops, she said, a smirk playing on her lips. Looks like it belongs in the mud after all. Just like you. Now get out of my sight before you ruin my photos. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain, and the sound of my own heart shattering. I fell to my knees in the wet grass. The cold mud seeped instantly through the thin fabric of my skirt, chilling my skin. My fingers scrambled desperately in the brown sludge, searching for the silver glimmer of Grandma's legacy. It was a degrading, frantic motion. I felt like an animal scavenging for scraps while the royals watched from their tower. Above me, Preston chuckled. The sound was dry and completely devoid of humanity. "Look at that," he sneered, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. "Straight for the dirt. It really is instinct for the poor, isn't it? You people just love wallowing in filth. It is like you cannot help yourselves." That was it. The snap was audible in my own head, a sharp fracture in my composure. I closed my fingers around the muddy pin and stood up. I did not care about the mud dripping from my hands. I did not care about the rain plastering my hair to my face. I stepped onto the pristine limestone terrace, invading their dry sanctuary, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the expensive stone. My eyes locked on Preston's smug face. I raised my hand, ready to wipe that smile off his face forever. I was going to slap him. I was going to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused. But I never got the chance. Before my hand could connect, Bianca moved. She was faster than I expected, fueled by a sudden vicious energy. She reached out and snatched the heavy crystal goblet from Preston's hand. The dark red liquid sloshed violently against the rim, staining her manicured fingers. "You do not touch him!" she shrieked, her voice piercing the humid air. "And you do not ruin my wedding." With a vicious swing of her arm, she threw the contents of the glass directly at me. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the arc of the deep red Cabernet Sauvignon flying through the air, a dark wave crashing against the gray sky. It hit me full in the face, blinding me. It splashed down my chest, soaking into the beige linen of my dress instantly. The shock was physical, like a punch to the gut. The wine was cold and acidic, stinging my eyes and filling my nose with the sharp scent of alcohol. I gasped, sputtering as the liquid ran into my mouth, tasting of expensive tannins and utter humiliation. I stood there, frozen, arms slightly raised as the dark red stain spread aggressively across my light dress. It looked horrific. Against the pale fabric, the wine looked exactly like fresh arterial blood. It dripped from my chin, ran down my neck in jagged rivulets, and pooled at my waist, turning the vintage linen into a gruesome display. I looked like a murder victim standing at the edge of a fairy tale. Inside the glass tent, the music stopped abruptly. I heard it even through the thick panes. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, loud enough to be heard over the drumming rain. Dozens of faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and perverse delight. They were watching a train wreck. They were watching the final destruction of Zara King, broadcast live for their entertainment. Bianca stood panting slightly, the empty glass still clutched in her hand like a weapon. A single drop of red wine clung to the rim before falling to the white stone floor, shattering into a red star. She did not look sorry. She looked triumphant. The wine burned. That was the first thing my brain registered through the shock. It was not just cold and wet. It was acidic. It seeped into my eyes, stinging like fire and blurring my vision into a haze of red and gray. I gasped, bringing my hands up to my face instinctively, but my hands were covered in mud, so I only succeeded in smearing grit into my eyes along with the alcohol. I stood there blind and gasping, feeling the expensive vintage Cabernet drip off my nose and chin, soaking into the fabric of the dress I had loved 10 minutes ago. It felt heavy now, a sodden weight dragging me down. Bianca did not step back in horror at what she had done. She did not cover her mouth or apologize. She stepped closer, her white dress glowing in the gloom like a beacon of purity against my filth. She pointed a finger at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. "Look at you," she screamed, her voice cracking with the force of her rage. "You are disgusting. You are actually disgusting. You make my eyes dirty just looking at you." She stomped her foot on the limestone, heedless of the splash. "I spent a year planning this, a year making sure everything was perfect, every flower, every napkin, every light. And you show up here looking like a beggar and ruin it." You stain everything you touch, Zara. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the wine from my eyes, trying to see my sister. But the person standing in front of me was a stranger. There was no love in her eyes, there was no shared history, there was only satisfaction. She was glad she had done it. She felt justified. She looked at me dripping and shivering, and she smiled a small, cruel smile that did not reach her eyes. You are dirt, she spat the word out like a curse. That is what you are. You are the dirt stuck to the bottom of my shoe. You are the mud on the hem of my dress. You are nothing. You are absolutely nothing. Now get out. Get out before I have the security guards drag you out by your hair. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The cruelty was so absolute it paralyzed me. I looked past Bianca, past Preston, who was smirking into his drink, and toward the glass wall of the tent. I expected to see shock. I expected to see anyone running to help me. Instead, I saw a sea of glowing rectangles, phones, dozens of them. They were pressed against the glass, held high to capture the best angle. Flashes went off, bursting like miniature lightning strikes, blinding me further. I saw the red tally lights of recording indicators. I saw people laughing, pointing, typing furiously into their screens. They were not horrified. They were entertained. I was not a person to them. I was content. I was a viral moment waiting to happen. The jealous sister. The wedding crasher. The woman covered in wine and mud. I could almost see the captions they were writing. I could imagine the comments rolling in on the live streams, mocking my dress, mocking my humiliation, laughing at the poor girl who thought she belonged with the elite. The shame washed over me hotter than the sting of the wine. I was an exhibit in a zoo, and my family had sold the tickets. Bianca turned back to her guests, posing for the cameras, her chin high, playing the victim perfectly, while I stood there destroyed. I was dirt. To them, I was just dirt. The heavy glass door swung open with a pneumatic hiss, cutting through the tension on the terrace. My father, Harold, stepped out into the storm. He looked impeccable in his black tuxedo, his bow tie perfectly straight, his posture rigid with authority. For a fleeting, foolish second, the little girl inside me surged to the surface. I thought he had seen everything from the window. I thought he had seen his youngest daughter assault his eldest. I thought he was coming to save me. Dad. I choked out the word, tasting of copper and wine. I took a stumbling step toward him, my hand reaching out instinctively for comfort. I needed him to tell me this was a nightmare. I needed him to be the father who used to carry me on his shoulders. Harold marched across the wet stone, his face flushed not with concern but with fury. He did not look at my wine-soaked dress. He did not look at the mud on my knees, or the terror in my eyes. His gaze was fixed solely on Bianca, who let out a fresh theatrical sob the moment she saw him. He brushed past me and then turned abruptly. I expected a question. I expected him to ask if I was hurt. Instead, his hand lashed out. It was not a closed fist, but a hard, open-handed shove against my shoulder that carried the full weight of his disappointment. The force of it sent me reeling backward. My heels slipped on the wet pavers, and I crashed down hard onto the unforgiving metal chair I had been exiled to earlier. The metal edge dug into my spine, knocking the wind out of my lungs with a painful wheeze. "What is wrong with you?" Harold roared, his voice booming over the sound of the rain. "Look at your sister. Just look at her face." I gasped for air, looking at Bianca. She was perfectly fine, dry and pristine under the awning, except for a few crocodile tears. "She is crying, Zara," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You upset the bride. You made her cry and ruin her makeup 10 minutes before the grand entrance. Do you have any idea how much that makeup artist cost? Do you have any idea how hard we worked to make this day perfect?" I stared at him, unable to comprehend the twisted logic. "Dad, she threw wine on me?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "She called me dirt. She threw Grandma's pin in the mud." Harold scoffed, a sound of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Because you act like it," he spat. "Look at you. You come here in rags, dragging your misery around like a heavy blanket. You could not just stay away, could you? You had to come here and remind us all of your failures. You had to stain this day with your presence. He loomed over me, blocking out the gray sky. This is exactly why we prayed you would marry someone like Preston. Look at him, Zara. A vice president, a man of status, a man who can provide. And who did you choose? Darius. That unemployed loser who drives a beat-up truck and fixes toilets for a living? You threw your life away for a man who cannot even buy you a decent dress, and now you want to ruin your sister's chance at happiness because you are bitter. You are jealous because she won, and you lost. I am not bitter. I sobbed, the rain mixing with the tears I could no longer hold back. I am your daughter. Harold straightened his jacket, looking down at me with cold, hard eyes that held no recognition. My daughter knows how to behave. My daughter marries well and brings honor to this family. Right now, looking at you wallowing in the mud, I do not know who you are. But you are certainly a disappointment. You are a stain on this family, Zara. He turned his back to me, offering his arm to Bianca. Come inside, sweetheart, he said, his voice instantly softening to a coo. Let us get you fixed up. Forget about her. She is not worth the mascara. I watched them walk away, the three of them united in their perfection, leaving me shattered on a wet metal chair. I was completely alone. The rejection was total. I had no father. I had no mother. I had no sister. The rain beat down on me, washing away the last of my hope, but it could not wash away the wine or the shame. I buried my face in my hands and let out a scream that was swallowed by the storm. I was broken, truly broken. I buried my face in my trembling hands, ready to dissolve into the wet earth, but a sound cut through the drumming of the rain. It was not thunder. It was something far more mechanical and aggressive. A deep, guttural roar vibrated in the air, shaking the very pavers beneath me. It started as a low growl at the bottom of the hill and escalated rapidly into a deafening bellow that drowned out the jazz band inside the tent. Heads turned inside the glass pavilion. The guests who had been laughing at my misery moments ago now pressed their faces against the glass in confusion. The sound was raw power. It was the unmistakable scream of a massive V8 engine pushed to its limit. Twin beams of high-intensity headlights cut through the gloom, blindingly bright against the gray storm. A vehicle tore around the final curve of the driveway, ignoring the valet stand completely. It was not a limousine. It was not a luxury sedan. It was a monster. A 1970 Ford F-150 pickup truck with a body that had seen decades of hard labor. The paint was a patchwork of matte black primer and faded original blue, and the bumper was heavy steel scarred from use. To the elites watching from the safety of the tent, it looked like a piece of junk from a scrapyard. But to anyone who knew cars, the sound of that engine told a different story. It did not rattle. It roared with the precision of a race car. The security team stationed at the gate scrambled in panic. Two guards in rain slickers ran into the driveway, waving their flashlights frantically, trying to intercept the intruder. They might as well have been trying to stop a freight train. The truck did not slow down. It swerved with terrifying control, drifting slightly on the wet gravel, its massive tires biting into the expensive landscaping without hesitation. The driver knew exactly what he was doing, handling the heavy machine like it was a toy. Gasps rippled through the crowd on the patio. Preston dropped his drink, the glass shattering on the stone. Bianca shrieked, clutching her husband's arm. They watched in horror as the truck barreled straight toward them. It looked like it was going to ram right into the limestone terrace. At the last possible second, the driver slammed on the brakes. The truck locked up, sliding sideways in a controlled skid. It came to a halt with violent precision, the heavy steel grille stopping just inches from the edge of the patio. The maneuver was calculated and aggressive. As the truck slid, its massive rear tires churned through a deep puddle of brown sludge. A thick wave of mud launched into the air in a perfect arc. It flew over the low stone wall and landed with a heavy, wet slap directly onto the pristine white hood of Preston's rented Bentley parked nearby for display. The mud slid down the polished grille of the luxury car, staining the white paint brown. The silence that followed the engine cutting off was deafening. Inside the tent, the guests were paralyzed with shock. This was a violation of their curated world. A symbol of the working class crashing violently into their sanctuary of wealth. I lifted my head, wiping rain from my eyes, and stared at the truck. Steam hissed from the hot engine hood, mixing with the rain. It sat there dark and imposing, a beast panting after the hunt. And for the first time that night, the fear in the air was not mine. It belonged to them. The heavy steel door of the truck groaned as it was pushed open against the wind. A single boot hit the wet pavement with a heavy, authoritative thud. It was a Timberland work boot, scuffed at the toe and caked in fresh reddish Georgia clay. To the people watching from the dry safety of the glass tent, it was the footwear of a laborer, a man who worked with his hands and broke his back for a paycheck. They were right about the labor, but they were fatally wrong about the man. Darius stepped out into the storm. He did not run for cover. He did not hunch his shoulders against the driving rain. He stood to his full height, over 6 feet of solid muscle, honed by years of physical discipline. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt that clung to his chest, soaking through instantly in the deluge. His jeans were faded denim worn white at the knees, and his hands, hanging loose by his sides, were rough and calloused. He looked like the antithesis of everything this wedding stood for. He was raw, unpolished, and real. Rainwater streamed down his face, dripping from his short beard, but he did not blink. He did not even glance at the Bentley he had just defaced, or the security guards who were now hanging back, unsure of whether to approach a man who radiated such palpable intensity. His dark eyes scanned the patio, ignoring Preston, ignoring Bianca, ignoring the opulence. They locked onto me instantly. I was still huddled on the metal chair, shivering violently, wine and mud drying into a sticky crust on my skin. When Darius saw me, the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. His jaw muscle ticked once, a sharp spasm of controlled fury. He started walking toward me. His stride was long and purposeful. He did not rush, but there was a violence in his movement, a predatory grace that made the breath catch in my throat. He looked dangerous, not like a thug, but like a king who returns home to find his castle under siege. The guests inside the tent, who had been laughing moments ago, fell silent. Their faces pressed against the glass, captivated by the sheer force of his presence. He stopped right in front of me, blocking the wind with his body. He looked down, his eyes taking in every detail of my humiliation. The wine in my hair, the mud on my knees, the terror that was slowly fading into relief. Without a word, he reached for the zipper of his heavy canvas work jacket. He peeled it off, his movements fluid and efficient, leaving him exposed to the elements in just his t-shirt. He shook the jacket out once, snapping the fabric taut, then draped it over my shoulders. It was heavy and warm, still holding his body heat and smelling of cedar and rain. He pulled the collar up high, shielding my face from the downpour, and more importantly, shielding me from the greedy, voyeuristic eyes of the guests in the tent. He created a wall between me and the world, a private sanctuary in the middle of the storm. For the first time in hours, I stopped shaking. He rested his hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. He was here, and for the first time, I pitied the people who had hurt me, because they had just woken a sleeping giant. Preston minced his way to the edge of the limestone terrace, stopping just short of the wet grass. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and pressed it to his nose, as if the mere presence of honest work smelled like sewage. He looked Darius up and down, his eyes lingering on the mud-caked boots and the wet t-shirt. "Well, look who it is," Preston drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. The head of the moving crew finally decided to show up. I was wondering when the help would arrive to clear out the trash. He gestured vaguely at Darius's truck, and then at me, huddled under the jacket. "Listen, buddy, I do not know who called you, but you need to move that heap of scrap metal immediately. You got mud on my Bentley. Do you have any idea how much it costs to detail a car like that? Probably more than you make in a year." Darius did not turn his head. He kept his eyes fixed on me, checking for injuries. his hand still resting protectively on my shoulder. His silence seemed to infuriate Preston, who was used to being the center of attention. "Hey, I am talking to you," Preston snapped, stepping closer, but careful not to get his patent leather shoes wet. "Are you deaf as well as dirty? I said move the truck, and take this wet dog with you while you are at it." Darius finally turned. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator engaging a target. He straightened to his full height, towering over Preston even from the lower ground. The rain plastered his shirt to his chest, emphasizing the sheer physical power he held in check. He looked at Preston, not with anger, but with the kind of detached curiosity a scientist might have for a particularly unpleasant insect. Preston faltered for a second, intimidated by the sheer size of the man in front of him. But his arrogance was a powerful drug. He scoffed, reaching into his tuxedo jacket and pulling out a sleek silver money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill, the portrait of Benjamin Franklin staring up from the paper. "I get it," Preston said, recovering his sneer. "Everyone has a price, right? You want a little extra for the inconvenience? Fine. Here." He flicked his wrist, tossing the bill into the air. It fluttered down, landing face up in the brown sludge right between Darius's boots. "Consider that a tip," Preston said, smirking. "Now be a good boy and get this mess out of my sight. Go buy yourself a new shirt. Maybe some soap. Just get out of here before I call the police and have you dragged away for vagrancy." The silence that descended on the patio was heavier than the storm. The rain seemed to hush, the wind held its breath. Inside the tent, the guests watched with bated breath, waiting for the explosion. They expected the laborer to scramble for the money. They expected him to bow and scrape, or maybe to throw a punch. Darius looked down at the money soaking into the mud. He stared at it for a long beat, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly raised his eyes to meet Preston's. He did not yell. He did not rage. Instead, the corner of his mouth quirked up in a small, cold smile. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who knew a secret that was about to destroy everyone in the room. He stepped over the bill, pressing it into the mud with the heel of his boot without even looking down. The silence that Darius left in the wake of his silent refusal was shattered by the sharp click of heels on the limestone. Joyce pushed past my father, her face contorted in a mask of social horror. She did not look at the mud splattered on Preston's expensive car. She did not look at her daughter shivering in the rain. She looked at Darius with a nose wrinkled so tight it threatened to crack her foundation. "Get him out of here, Harold," she shrilled, waving a hand in front of her face, as if wafting away a noxious fume. "Can you not smell him? It is thick enough to taste. The stench of sweat and manual labor is going to wilt my imported hydrangeas. It is offensive. It is polluting the air of my daughter's wedding." Bianca let out a bark of laughter, emboldened by her mother's cruelty and her husband's arrogance. She leaned against Preston, resting her head on his shoulder while staring daggers at me. "It makes sense, doesn't it?" she sneered. "It is almost poetic. The trash found the scrap metal. You two deserve each other down there in the gutter. You can live in that rust bucket truck and raise little dirt babies." Panic clawed at my throat. It rose up, choking me harder than the cold or the shame. I knew this world. I knew how it worked. Men like Preston and women like my mother held all the cards. If Darius stayed, if he escalated this, they would destroy him. I had seen security guards rough up people for less. I had seen the police called on black men for simply existing in this neighborhood. I could not let him get hurt because of me. He was the only good thing I had, and they were going to crush him just to prove they could. "Darius, please," I whispered, tugging frantically at his arm. My fingers slipped on his wet skin, but I dug my nails in, trying to drag him back toward the truck. "We have to go. Please just take me home. They will call the police. They will hurt you. It is not worth it. I am not worth it. Just let them have their win." I pulled with all my remaining strength, but Darius was immovable. He was a statue carved from granite, rooted deep in the earth. He did not step back. He did not flinch at their insults. Instead, he shifted his weight, turning his body slightly to shield me even more from their venom. He reached down and took my hand. His palm was rough, calloused from work, warm and enormous. He enveloped my freezing, trembling hand in his and squeezed. It was not a squeeze of fear. It was a transfer of power. It was a silent message that vibrated up my arm and settled into my chest. He was not leaving. He was not afraid. And for the first time in my life, he was making sure I did not have to be afraid either. He looked down at me, his dark eyes locking onto mine, ignoring the screaming family on the patio. He did not speak to them. He spoke only to me, with a gaze so intense it burned. "I am not going anywhere, Zara," he said, his voice a low rumble that I felt in my bones. "And neither are you. Not until they understand exactly who they are dealing with." He turned back to the patio, still holding my hand, his grip an unbreakable tether. The way he stood there, chest out, head high, made the tuxedo-clad men on the terrace look like children playing dress-up. He took a breath, and the air around him seemed to charge with electricity. Darius reached up with his free hand, his rough thumb brushing against my cheekbone. He smeared the drying, tacky residue of the expensive Cabernet, examining the red stain on his own skin before looking back into my eyes. His expression was soft, intimate, almost heartbreakingly tender. It was the specific look he gave me when I woke up from a nightmare, breathless and scared in the middle of the night. For a few seconds he ignored the screaming mother, the sneering sister, and the arrogant groom. The storm and the audience ceased to exist. There was only the two of us in a bubble of silent communication. He tucked a strand of wet, matted hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my jawline with a gentleness that made my chest ache. Then he spoke. His voice was not a shout. It was a low rumble, barely louder than the falling rain, but it carried an acoustic weight that cut through the noise on the patio like a razor. "Did they do this to you?" he asked. It was not really a question. It was a confirmation. He was looking at the wine soaking my chest, the mud caked on my knees, the shivering that rattled my bones. He looked at the lonely metal chair sitting exposed in the downpour, and then back at the warm, dry tent. He was piecing together the timeline of my humiliation. I nodded, unable to form words, my throat closed tight with shame. A single hot tear escaped, tracking through the wine stain on my cheek. Darius caught it with his thumb. He did not say it is okay, because it was not. He just nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of my pain, letting it fuel him. Then he turned his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. As his gaze left my face and landed on Harold, the tenderness evaporated instantly. It was like watching a light switch flip. The warmth that had been there a second ago was replaced by a cold, predatory focus. His eyes, usually so full of laughter, turned black, hard, and absolutely pitiless. He looked at Harold, not as a father-in-law, not even as a man, but as a target. "Is this how you treat your daughter?" Darius asked, his voice projecting, now hitting the stone terrace with the force of a physical blow. "You let her sit in the filth while you drink champagne. You let them throw alcohol on her like she is an animal. Is this your idea of family, Harold?" Harold bristled, his face turning a mottled shade of plum. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to regain the authority he felt slipping away under Darius's scrutiny. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisted with malice. "She is not my daughter," he shouted, spitting the words out into the rain. "She forfeited that title the moment she married a loser like you. She is a disgrace. She is a stain on this family and on this day. I do not want her here. I do not want you here. Get out, both of you. Get off my property before I have you thrown out like the trash you are." Darius stared at him. He did not blink. He did not flinch at the insult. He just stood there, processing the absolute rejection, the cruelty of a father disowning his child in front of an audience of strangers. I felt the muscles in Darius's arm tighten, steel cords bunching under his skin as he held me. I had called him to come pick me up. I had just wanted to go home, to hide under the covers and forget this night ever happened. That was the plan. Rescue and retreat. But as I looked up at my husband's profile, I saw that plan disintegrate. The jaw set like concrete, the eyes narrowed into slits. The stillness that fell over him was terrifying. He was not just here to take me home anymore. He was here to burn their kingdom to the ground. He took a deep breath, the air hissing through his nose, and made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire night. "Fine," Darius said, his voice devoid of all emotion, a judge passing a final sentence. "If she is not your daughter, then you will not mind what happens next." "My wife needs dry clothes," Darius announced, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain like a knife. "She needs to get warm. She needs a place to sit that is not made of rusting metal. And before this night is over, she is going to get a sincere apology from every single person standing on this patio. We are going inside." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who was accustomed to shaping reality to his will. He did not wait for permission. He tightened his grip on my waist and took a step toward the limestone stairs. Harold turned a shade of purple that clashed violently with the festive floral arrangements. "You will do no such thing," he sputtered. "You are trespassing. You are dirty. You are not ruining the interior of this venue with your filth. Marcus, remove them. Now. Use force if necessary." The command hung in the humid air. From the shadows of the awning, the head of the security team emerged. Marcus was a mountain of a man built like a tank, with a scar running through his left eyebrow and the weary, alert eyes of a combat veteran. He had been standing stoically by the door all night, watching the drama unfold with professional detachment. Now he stepped forward, his hand resting instinctively on his belt, blocking the path to the door. "Sir Marcus," said his voice, a deep, gravelly bass that vibrated in my chest, "I cannot let you pass. The property owner has rescinded your invitation. Please return to your vehicle and vacate the premises immediately. I do not want to make this physical." Preston snickered from the sidelines. "Yeah, listen to the man. Get out of here before he breaks you in half." Darius did not stop. He did not even slow down. He walked right up to Marcus until they were chest to chest. The size difference was negligible. Darius might have been wearing a wet t-shirt instead of a tactical vest, but he radiated a kinetic energy that made the air between them crackle. Darius stopped. He looked Marcus dead in the eye. The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Then Darius leaned in. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He whispered something so low that even standing right next to him I could not catch the words. It was a short sentence, maybe 5 words. The effect was instantaneous. Marcus blinked. His professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock, followed immediately by a rigid military recognition. His eyes darted to Darius's face, searching for something and finding it. The aggression drained out of his posture instantly. He straightened his spine, snapping his heels together in a reflex that looked almost like a salute. "Understood," Sir Marcus said, his voice stripped of all threat. "My apologies. I did not recognize you in the dark." He stepped aside. Not just a small step, but a wide, respectful retreat, clearing the entire doorway. He actually reached out and held the heavy glass door open for us, his head bowed slightly. Harold let out a strangled noise of disbelief. "Marcus, what are you doing? I pay your salary. I told you to throw them out. Do your job." Marcus did not even look at my father. He kept his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "I am doing my job, sir," he replied cryptically. "You might want to step aside." Darius did not waste a moment. He guided me up the stairs, his arm like an iron bar around my waist, supporting me as my legs threatened to give out. We walked right past Bianca, who was clutching her pearls, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. We walked past Preston, who looked like he was trying to solve a complex math problem and failing. We crossed the threshold, leaving the storm behind. The transition was jarring. One second we were in the wind and rain, and the next we were enveloped in the silent, climate-controlled perfection of the glass tent. The air was cool and smelled of expensive perfume and lilies. We stepped onto the runner. It was a plush, pristine white carpet that ran the length of the room leading to the stage. Darius did not hesitate. He walked us right down the center. With every step, his heavy work boots left a thick cake of red Georgia clay on the white wool. My heels dripped muddy water, creating dark, jagged stains next to his footprints. Squish, squish, squish. The sound was obscenely loud in the sudden silence of the room. We were inside. We were marking their territory with our pain, and nobody dared to stop us. The transition from the violent storm to the hermetically sealed luxury was disorienting. The air inside the glass cathedral was not just dry, it was heavily scented with gardenias and expensive cologne, a thick, cloying atmosphere that felt like breathing in money. The lighting was amber and soft, designed to make diamonds sparkle and skin look flawless. It was a stark, violent contrast to the gray misery we had just escaped. A tower of champagne coupes shimmered in the center of the room, untouched and perfect. The jazz band had stopped playing their instruments, hanging loose in their hands as they stared. We were an ink blot on a white page, a glitch in the matrix of their perfection. Darius did not hurry. He walked with a heavy, deliberate cadence. Every step his work boots took left a thick smear of Georgia red clay on the pristine white carpet runner. It was a desecration. I could hear the guests gasping, pulling their silk hems and velvet trousers back, as if our poverty might be contagious. They parted before us like the Red Sea, not out of respect, but out of a mixture of horror and confusion. They looked at Darius's wet t-shirt and my wine-soaked dress with eyes wide in judgment. I saw my cousin whispering behind her hand. I saw a business associate of my father's sneer and turn his back. We were walking through a gauntlet of rejection. Darius led me straight to the center of the room. There was a round table set for two directly in front of the stage. It was the sweetheart table meant for Bianca and Preston, but currently empty as they were still outside, recovering from the mud incident. It was the focal point of the entire room. The throne. Darius pulled out the high-backed velvet chair. The screech of the legs against the floor echoed in the silence, slicing through the tension. He gestured for me to sit. I froze. Panic seized my throat. I could not sit there. That was for the bride. That was center stage. Everyone was watching, hundreds of eyes boring into my back, judging my ruined dress, judging the man I loved. I tried to pull away to find a dark corner to hide in until this nightmare ended. I felt small, dirty, and exposed like a stain that needed to be scrubbed away. I started to shake my head, tears pricking my eyes again, ready to bolt for the service exit. But Darius put his hands on my shoulders. His grip was heavy, warm, and grounding. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, oblivious to the hostile crowd surrounding us. "Look at me," he commanded softly, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I looked up, meeting his fierce, dark gaze. "Stop shaking, Zara. You do not hide. Not today. Not ever again." He wiped a stray drop of wine from my chin, his touch gentle but firm. "Lift your head up. You are not their victim. You are my wife. You are a queen. And queens do not sit in the corner. Now sit." I swallowed hard, drawing strength from his absolute certainty. I sat. The velvet was soft against my wet skin. Darius pushed the chair in and stood behind me, his hand resting on the back of the seat, a dark, silent sentinel daring anyone to challenge us. We had taken the castle. Preston scrambled onto the raised platform, his patent leather shoes slipping slightly on the wet floor where he had tracked in rain. He snatched the microphone from the stand with a violence that sent a high-pitched feedback screech tearing through the room. The guests winced, covering their ears, but Preston did not apologize. He needed control. He needed the eyes off the man in the mud-caked boots, and back on him, the man in the $5,000 tuxedo. He tapped the microphone aggressively. "All right, everyone, settle down," he barked, his voice booming through the speakers. "I apologize for the unscheduled entertainment. It seems the venue security is a bit lax, allowing the riffraff to wander in off the street. But let us not let a couple of wedding crashers ruin the vibe of excellence in this room." He smoothed his lapels, his chest puffing out. "This night is about success. It is about power. And looking around this room, I see a lot of power. But you have not seen anything yet. He paced the stage, his eyes darting to Darius, who sat motionless at the center table. Preston's smile was tight manic. Many of you know I have been working on a deal, a massive deal. But tonight, I can finally make it official. As of Monday morning, I am stepping into the role of Senior Vice President at Onyx Horizon. A murmur went through the crowd. Onyx Horizon was a myth, a legend in Atlanta. The venture capital firm that owned half the city's skyline. Preston basked in the reaction. That is right, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. The ghost investor himself finally realized he needed a face for the company. Someone who knows how the real world works. Someone with pedigree. Someone who belongs in rooms like this, not someone who fixes the plumbing. He laughed at his own joke, pointing a finger vaguely in Darius's direction. I am going to be running the Southeast Division. That means every startup, every real estate development, every major loan in Atlanta goes through me. I am the gatekeeper. I am the kingmaker. If you want to do business in this town, you come to me. And let me tell you, I have a long memory for who supported me and who did not. He raised his glass high, the liquid sloshing over the rim. To the future. My future. A future where we clean up this city and put people back where they belong. The crowd cheered hesitantly, caught between his charisma and the awkward tension radiating from the center table. Below the stage, Darius did not look up. He sat with his back straight, his presence occupying the space like a physical weight. Slowly, calmly, he reached into the pocket of his wet jeans. He pulled out a sleek black smartphone. The screen illuminated his face in the dim light. His thumbs moved with lethal precision, typing out a message. He was not listening to the speech. He was ending it. While Preston bragged about being the gatekeeper, Darius was quietly changing the locks. Preston leaned into the microphone, his face flushed with adrenaline and expensive scotch. But seriously, folks, he said, winking at a group of his college buddies standing near the bar. Onyx Horizon needs a wake-up call. It has gotten soft. Too many HR sensitivity training seminars and not enough closing deals. He paced the stage, gesturing wildly with his free hand. I am going to bring back real work ethic. We are going to clock in early and stay late. None of that relaxed attitude. You know how it is in this city sometimes. He paused for effect, glancing pointedly at the waitstaff, who were mostly black, and then sweeping his gaze over my family. We are going to operate on Greenwich Mean Time, not CPT. You know what I mean, right? Colored people time. The joke landed with a thud. It was not just insensitive, it was a slap in the face to half the room, including his new wife and in-laws. It was the kind of casual racism that hides behind a veneer of humor, daring anyone to call it out and be labeled as too sensitive. But Preston laughed, a loud, braying sound that demanded validation. I am kidding, but seriously, punctuality is key. I looked at my parents. Surely this was the line. Surely Harold, who had marched in protests in his youth, would stand up. Surely Joyce, who prided herself on her heritage when it suited her, would say something. Instead, Harold chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound, but it was a laugh. Oh, Preston, he called out, raising his glass. You are a hard taskmaster. Keep them in line. Joyce giggled, a high-pitched, nervous titter. He is just so driven, she whispered loudly to her neighbor. He does not mean anything by it. It is just business talk. Bianca smiled, though her eyes were tight at the corners. She smoothed her dress actively, choosing to ignore the insult to her own race in exchange for the proximity to power. He is just joking, she mouthed to a cousin who looked ready to walk out. I felt my blood boil. My fingernails dug into my palms so hard I thought they might draw blood. The betrayal was absolute. They were not just selling me out, they were selling out their dignity, their history, their very selves, all for a proximity to a man who viewed them as a punchline. I wanted to scream, I wanted to flip the table. But Darius did not move. He did not clench his jaw. He did not glare. He simply sat there, relaxed in his chair, watching Preston with an expression of mild interest, like a biologist observing a fascinatingly stupid specimen. He tapped one finger rhythmically against the tablecloth. He was not angry because lions do not concern themselves with the opinions of sheep. He was just waiting, watching the man dig his own grave one ignorant sentence at a time. Preston hopped off the stage, his shoes clicking on the hardwood floor with a rhythm that screamed self-importance. He signaled a passing waiter, snapping his fingers near the young man's face. "Give me that bottle," he demanded, snatching a magnum of Dom Perignon from the tray. He did not bother with a glass for himself. He cradled the heavy bottle in one arm like a trophy and began his victory lap, weaving through the tables, accepting back slaps and handshakes. But his destination was clear. He was walking a straight line toward the center table, where Darius sat like a stone monolith. Preston wanted to gloat. He wanted to see the fear in the eyes of the man he had humiliated. He stopped right next to Darius's chair, looming over him. He tilted the bottle, pouring a stream of foaming champagne into the empty glass in front of Darius. He poured too fast, and the liquid overflowed, spilling onto the tablecloth and splashing near Darius's hand. "Oops," Preston said, his eyes glinting with malice. "My hand slipped. Enjoy it, big guy. It is probably the only time you will get to taste a $300 bottle of wine. Drink up. Maybe it will help you forget that you are sitting at the wrong table." Darius did not move his hand. He did not wipe away the spill. He looked at the bubbling liquid, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Preston's gaze. His expression was mask-like, perfectly neutral. It was the face of a poker player who had already seen his opponent's cards. "I have done some reading about your new employer," Darius said, his voice conversational, mild even. "Onyx Horizon. They have a reputation. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal just last week. They said the firm is notorious for its strict code of ethics, zero tolerance for misconduct, rigorous background checks." Darius paused, tilting his head slightly as if genuinely concerned. "With everything that has happened tonight, the wine throwing the insults, the scene outside. Are you not worried, Preston? Are you not concerned that the vetting process might flag this behavior?" Preston stared at him for a second, his brain trying to process the audacity of the question coming from a man in a wet t-shirt. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, braying sound that shook his whole body. He set the bottle down on the table with a heavy thud and leaned in close, invading Darius's personal space. He reached out and patted Darius on the shoulder, his hand heavy and condescending, striking the muscle like he was petting a dog. "Oh, you are adorable," Preston said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You really do not get it, do you? You think the rules apply to people like me." He leaned closer, his breath hot and smelling of scotch and expensive mints. "Listen closely, because I am only going to teach you this once. Ethics, morality, rules, those are guardrails for the poor. They are designed to keep people like you in line so you do not get uppity. At my level, at the level of Onyx Horizon, we do not follow the law. We are the law." He squeezed Darius's shoulder, his fingers digging in, trying to assert dominance over the harder man. "When you generate the kind of revenue I do, you can do whatever you want. I could burn this tent down right now, and by tomorrow morning, I would have an insurance check and a permit to build a bigger one. So no, I am not worried about a background check. I am the one who checks the boxes." Darius looked at the hand on his shoulder. He looked at it for a long time, until Preston started to feel uncomfortable and slowly pulled it back. "I see," Darius said softly. "So you are untouchable." Preston straightened his jacket, smirking. "Now you are catching on." Finally. I watched the color drain from Darius's knuckles as his hand rested on the tablecloth, not from fear, but from the restraint it took not to dismantle Preston right there. Darius leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from curiosity to a feigned look of impressed bewilderment. "But surely the vetting process at a firm like Onyx Horizon is airtight?" Darius pressed his voice smooth and deceptive. "I have heard they run forensic accounting on all executive hires. They check every wire transfer, every deposit. How does one bypass a system designed to catch exactly that kind of thing? Preston rolled his eyes, taking a heavy swig from the magnum of champagne. You really are simple, aren't you? Systems are made by people, and people have needs. Audits are for the rank and file. When you operate at the executive level, it is not about what is on the spreadsheet. It is about who holds the pen. He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive alcohol wafting off him in waves. I knew the director of operations. Great guy, expensive taste in boats. But he had a little liquidity problem with his divorce settlement, so I helped him out. A little envelope, $50,000 in cash, untraceable. Just a friendly gift between future colleagues. And suddenly, my file got moved from the pending pile to the approved pile. No forensic audit, no questions asked, just a handshake and a welcome aboard. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. He was admitting to bribery. He was confessing to a felony in the middle of a crowded room because his ego was so inflated he thought he was untouchable. I looked toward my parents expecting to see horror, or at least caution. Instead, Harold was beaming. He walked over to the table, clapping Preston on the back. "That is right," Harold boomed, his voice full of pride. "You have to spend money to make money. It is the cost of doing business." Darius looked at Harold, his gaze piercing. $50,000 cash. That is a significant amount of liquid capital. Where does a junior banker get that kind of cash without triggering banking alerts? Preston laughed, pointing a finger at Harold. That is where family comes in. Harry here is a visionary. He knows a blue-chip stock when he sees one. He did not hesitate. "Did you, Harry?" Harold puffed out his chest, adjusting his bow tie. "Not for a second. I went to the bank the next morning. Took out a second mortgage on the estate, cashed out the equity, handed it to Preston in a briefcase. It was the smartest investment I ever made." The room spun. My parents had mortgaged their home, the house I grew up in. They had put their own roof on the line to fund a bribe for this man. They had risked everything on a criminal act while telling me they could not help me with tuition years ago. Bianca stepped up beside Preston, wrapping her arm around his waist and looking at me with a pitying sneer. "Do not look so shocked, Zara," she said. "It is called smart investing. Daddy knows Preston is going to triple that money with his first quarterly bonus. We are building a dynasty here. You would not understand that. You are too busy playing house with your mechanic to understand how real wealth is generated. Daddy bet on the winning horse. And you are just mad he did not bet on the donkey." Darius looked at Harold, then at Bianca, and finally back at Preston. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "So let me get this straight," Darius said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You bribed an executive with $50,000 of borrowed money secured against your father-in-law's primary residence. And you did it specifically to bypass a mandatory ethical background check." Preston smirked, tapping the side of his nose. "Ding, ding, ding. Give the man a prize. The handyman can be taught. That is how the big boys play the game. Now are you done asking stupid questions, or do I need to have security throw you back into the mud?" Darius nodded slowly. "No more questions," he said. "I think I have heard everything I needed to hear, and I think the board has too." A waiter in a white tuxedo jacket materialized at Preston's elbow, holding a small black leather folder with both hands. He looked apologetic for interrupting the flow of arrogance, but the bill for the magnum of Dom Perignon had to be settled. Preston snatched the folder without breaking eye contact with Darius. He did not even open it to check the total. He just laughed, a sound that was half scoff and half bark. "Actually, let us settle this one right now," Preston announced, his voice projecting to the surrounding tables. "I want everyone to see how real power pays. I want the help to understand what access looks like." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his midnight blue Tom Ford jacket and withdrew a single card. He held it between his index and middle finger like a throwing star. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the table. It landed with a distinctive heavy metallic clang that cut through the ambient noise of the room. It was not plastic. It was matte black made of anodized titanium, with silver lettering that caught the amber light of the chandeliers. To the uninitiated guests stretching their necks to see, it looked like a standard centurion card, the ultimate symbol of status. But to Darius, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like evidence. "You see this?" Preston asked, gesturing at the metal rectangle with a flourish. "This is a corporate issue. Direct from the top. Vanguard Tech. They are a subsidiary of Onyx Horizon. My signing bonus came with perks, boys. Infinite limit. No pre-authorization required. No questions asked." He looked at the waiter, who was hesitating to touch the expensive object. "Go ahead, take it," Preston urged. "Run it for the champagne. Run it for the flowers. Run it for the whole damn bar tab. Tonight Onyx Horizon is paying for the party. My future employer is generous enough to sponsor the best night of my life." The room buzzed with envy. A collective sigh of admiration went through the crowd. This was the pinnacle of success in their eyes. A company so powerful it paid for your excess without blinking. Bianca beamed, clutching Preston's arm and looking at the card like it was a holy relic. "My husband provides," she said loudly, shooting a look of pure pity in my direction. "He does not need to save coupons or drive a truck. He has the world at his fingertips." Darius leaned forward just an inch. His movement was so subtle that Preston was too busy preening to notice. Darius's eyes locked onto the card lying on the white tablecloth. He saw the embossed name Preston Vance freshly printed. But more importantly, he saw the logo in the top right corner, a stylized silver V inside a geometric hexagon. Vanguard Tech. Darius knew that logo. He knew it because he had sketched it on a napkin 5 years ago in a coffee shop in Seattle when he acquired the failing tech firm to handle secure data infrastructure for his portfolio companies. Vanguard Tech was not a consumer branch. It was back-end infrastructure. Their corporate cards were issued to exactly 4 people: the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and the Director of Security. They were restricted cards used for emergency server procurement and black site infrastructure costs. They were absolutely not for champagne towers at a wedding in Buckhead. Preston was not just a liar. He was not just a briber. He was a thief. He had somehow gotten his hands on a restricted-level executive card, likely through the same corrupt contact he had bribed, and was using operational funds to finance his vanity. This was not a perk. This was grand larceny. Darius's eyes narrowed into slits. The cold calculation returned, intensifying. He looked from the card to Preston's smug face and back to the card. The irony was suffocating. Preston was using Darius's own money to humiliate Darius's wife. He was burning company assets to fuel his ego. Preston had built a house of cards on a foundation of dynamite, and he had just handed Darius the match. Darius sat back in his chair, and a terrifying calm settled over him. He had seen enough. Darius stared at the black titanium card sitting on the tablecloth one last time before raising his eyes to meet Preston's gaze. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unsaid things, but Darius broke it with a voice smooth as polished glass. "Thank you for the information, Preston," he said, nodding slowly. "That was very detailed. I appreciate the transparency." Preston blinked, surprised by the lack of resistance. He let out a sharp, barking laugh, throwing his head back. "Do not mention it, big guy. Consider it a free education. Now you know what real success looks like. Try not to get too jealous. It is a long walk back to the truck." He snatched the card from the table and turned on his heel, presenting his back to Darius with ultimate dismissal. He strutted away toward the bar, raising the card high in the air like a conqueror returning with spoils of war. "Another round," he shouted to the bartender. "On the company!" Bianca hurried after him, casting one last sneer over her shoulder at me. "See, Zara," she hissed. "He handles business. Unlike your husband who just sits there. Enjoy the view from the cheap seats." I watched them go, my stomach churning with anxiety, But when I looked at Darius, the fear evaporated. He was not looking at them anymore. He was looking at his phone. He had pulled it from his pocket with a movement so fluid it was almost invisible. The screen glowed in the dim amber light of the tent, reflecting in his dark eyes. I leaned in closer and saw what was on the screen. It was not a text message to a friend. It was a secure encrypted communication app, the kind used by government agencies and high-level corporate security teams. The message was already drafted, waiting in the queue. To Director of Legal Affairs and Head of Global Security, from D. King, CEO. Subject, Code Red, Immediate Action Required. Target Preston Vance Incoming SVP, Violation Level 1 Embezzlement Bribery, Corporate Espionage. Action Terminate contract immediately. Freeze all associated assets. Notify federal authorities. Initiate protocol Scorched Earth. Darius's thumb hovered over the send button. He took a breath, a long, slow inhale that expanded his chest against the wet t-shirt. He looked up one last time at Preston, who was now popping the cork on another bottle of champagne, laughing with my father. They looked so happy, so secure in their stolen power. They had no idea the ground beneath them had already turned to quicksand. Darius pressed the button. The screen flashed a green confirmation command sent authorization verified. He locked the phone and set it face down on the table. A smile touched his lips. It was not the warm smile he saved for me. It was not even a polite social smile. It was cold. It was terrifying. It was the smile of a man who had just dropped the guillotine blade and was simply waiting for gravity to do the rest. "It is done," he whispered to me, his hand finding mine under the table. "Watch closely, Zara. The house of cards is about to fall." 3 minutes. That was exactly how long it took for the invisible machinery Darius had set in motion to grind its gears. The digital signal traveled from his phone to a server in Virginia, then to a boardroom in New York, and finally crashed down like a hammer onto the life of the man standing on stage. The champagne was still bubbling in the glasses on the tables. The band had just started a lively jazz number, and the guests were beginning to relax, returning to their conversations, assuming the drama was over. Preston was leaning against the microphone stand, looking like a man who owned the universe, his arm draped casually over the podium, while my parents gazed up at him with adoration. Then a sound cut through the music. It was a ringtone, loud and jarring, amplified by the microphone Preston was standing next to. He pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket, annoyed at first until he glanced at the screen. His expression transformed instantly from irritation to a smug, victorious grin. He held up a hand, signaling the band to stop playing. The music died away, leaving an expectant silence. "Hold on, everyone," Preston announced, his voice booming through the PA system. "You are all going to want to hear this. It is Simon, the CEO of the investment bank I am leaving. He is probably calling to beg me to stay, or to offer me a counteroffer. I will definitely refuse. Talk about perfect timing." He tapped the screen and switched it to speakerphone, holding the device directly against the microphone mesh. He wanted witnesses. He wanted Darius and me to hear exactly how important he was. He wanted the entire room to bask in his glory. "Hey," Simon Preston said, his tone dripping with oily charm. "You are live on the air, buddy. Say hello to the wedding party. I assume you are calling to tell me how much you are going to miss me." The voice that exploded from the speakers was not congratulatory. It was shrill, breathless, and edged with raw panic. It was the sound of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. "Preston! What the hell have you done?" Simon screamed. His voice cracked with fear, echoing off the glass walls of the tent, making half the guests jump in their seats. Preston's smile faltered, his brow furrowing in confusion. He laughed nervously, a jagged sound that convinced no one. "Simon, stop joking around. The guests are listening. Is this a roast? Is this part of the send-off?" "This is not a joke, you idiot!" Simon roared, and the terror in his voice sent a cold chill sweeping through the room. I have internal audit in my office right now. I have the ethics committee sealing your door with yellow tape. They are confiscating your hard drives, Preston. They are boxing up your files. My phone has been ringing for 60 seconds straight with calls from legal. Preston stared at the phone in his hand as if it had suddenly turned into a viper. He looked out at the crowd, his face draining of color. Simon, I do not understand. I am at my wedding. I have not done anything. You must have done something. Simon yelled, his voice trembling. We just received a Level 1 compliance breach notification. It came from the top, Preston. From the absolute top. They are freezing everything. The accounts, the pending merger. The entire deal is dead in the water because of you. They are citing gross misconduct and financial misappropriation. They are asking about the corporate card, Preston. They are asking why a card assigned to secure infrastructure is being flagged for hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal charges. Who did you cross? Who are you with right now? The silence in the tent was absolute. You could hear the rain hitting the roof, but inside it was dead quiet. Everyone was staring at the phone. Preston stood frozen on stage, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The arrogance was evaporating, leaving behind only a naked, terrified confusion. Darius sat back in his chair. He picked up his water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. His eyes locked on Preston. The trap had snapped shut. Preston slammed his thumb onto the red icon on his phone screen, cutting the connection with a violence that nearly cracked the glass. The screaming voice of his CEO vanished, but the echo of the accusations seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beating of Preston's own heart. He looked out at the sea of faces. The admiration he had basked in just moments ago had evaporated, replaced by skepticism and dawning horror. He laughed, but it was a wet, broken sound that fooled no one. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his upper lip with the back of his hand, smearing his expensive makeup. That was just Simon? He stammered, his voice pitching too high. He has a terrible sense of humor, always playing pranks on the new guys. It is a hazing ritual, that is all. Just a system glitch, a computer error. You know how technology is these days. Algorithms flagging false positives. It is nothing. Absolutely nothing. He looked toward Bianca, expecting her to back him up to laugh it off and save the moment. But Bianca was not looking at him. She was staring at her father. Harold was standing near the edge of the dance floor, his face gray. He was clutching his chest, looking as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He knew that Simon was not a man who played pranks. He knew what a Level 1 compliance breach meant. It meant the end. Then a sound shattered the fragile attempt at normalcy Preston was trying to build. It was a ringtone, standard and piercing, coming from Harold's jacket pocket. In the dead silence of the tent, it sounded like a fire alarm. Harold jumped, his hand fumbling to retrieve the device. He looked at the caller ID and his eyes bulged. It was his private banker, the man who handled his mortgage, his investments, his life. Harold answered, his hand shaking so badly, the phone rattled against his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice a rasp. He did not put it on speaker, but the room was so quiet that those standing nearby could hear the urgent, frantic tone of the voice on the other line. We watched the color drain out of Harold's face in real time. It started at his forehead and washed down, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tuxedo. "What do you mean?" frozen Harold whispered, but the whisper carried. "What do you mean seized? That is my house. That is my equity." He listened for another moment, and then he dropped the phone. It hit the white carpet with a dull thud. Harold looked up, his eyes locking onto Preston with a mixture of confusion and terror. "They froze it," Harold said, his voice trembling. "The bank. They just froze the home equity line. They froze my checking account. They froze everything. He said it has been flagged by the federal authorities. He said it is a RICO predicate. He said they are investigating the source of funds for suspected money laundering." The words money laundering tore through the room like shrapnel. The guests began to back away, creating a wide circle around the family, as if financial ruin was a contagious disease. The air in the tent grew heavy with the scent of disaster. The wedding was no longer a celebration. It was a crime scene. Bianca let out a small whimper, clutching her pearl necklace. "Daddy, what is happening? What did you do?" "I did nothing," Harold shouted, turning on Preston. "I gave the money to him. He said it was an investment. He said it was for the buy-in." Preston stood on the stage alone and exposed. The lie was unraveling faster than he could spin it. He looked at his father-in-law, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified look of a child who had broken something he could not fix. "It is a mistake," Preston insisted, but his voice was weak. "It is just a misunderstanding. I can fix this. I just need to make a call." But nobody believed him. The atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The magic of the evening was dead, replaced by the cold, hard reality of consequences. And in the center of the room, Darius sat watching it all with the patience of a man who had already written the ending of the story. The panic on stage was palpable, a living thing that thrashed and clawed for air. Preston was sweating profusely now, the expensive foundation he wore melting under the stage lights. He looked like a man trying to hold back the tide with a paper cup, desperate to regain control of a narrative that was spiraling violently into catastrophe. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another lie about banking errors and glitches, but a sound cut him off before he could utter a syllable. Screech. It was a harsh grating noise, metal legs dragging against a hardwood floor. In the terrified silence of the tent, it sounded like a gunshot. Every head turned, every pair of eyes shifted from the disintegration of the groom on stage to the center of the room. Darius was standing up. He moved slowly, deliberately. He did not rush. He pushed his velvet chair back with one hand, the friction creating that ear-splitting noise that demanded absolute attention. He rose to his full height, unfolding his massive frame, until he loomed over the seated guests like a dark mountain. The wet black t-shirt clung to his muscles, defining a physique built by hard labor and discipline. The mud on his boots seemed to mock the pristine white carpet. He looked out of place, and yet he looked like the only real thing in a room full of illusions. He did not look at the guests who shrank away from him. He did not look at me. His eyes were fixed on Preston with a laser intensity that made the groom flinch physically. Darius stood there for a beat, letting his presence fill the room, letting the weight of his silence press down on Preston's chest. "Turn it back on Preston," Darius said. His voice was not loud. He did not shout. He did not have a microphone. But the timbre of his voice was so deep, so rich with command, that it carried to the back of the tent effortlessly. It was the voice of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Simon is not finished speaking." Darius continued, his tone flat and hard as granite. "And I think everyone here deserves to hear the rest of what he has to say, especially you." Preston stared at him, his eyes bulging. The audacity of this man. The sheer unmitigated gall of the help telling the master what to do. Preston's face went from pale to a violent, blotchy red. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He was losing everything, his job, his reputation, his money, and now this mud-caked nobody was giving him orders at his own wedding. It was too much. The dam broke. "You shut your mouth, you dirty bricklayer," Preston screamed, losing all semblance of composure. He pointed a shaking finger at Darius, spitting as he yelled. "You think you can talk to me? You think you can stand there in my venue and give me orders? You are nothing. You are the dirt underneath my fingernails." He looked wildly around the room, searching for the muscle. "Marcus. Security. Get in here. Get this trash out of my face. I want him gone. I want him thrown out into the street where he belongs. Do not just stand there. Toke him out." Preston panted, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He waited for the rush of footsteps. He waited for the heavy hands of the guards to grab Darius and drag him away, kicking and screaming. He waited to see order restored, to see his hierarchy reasserted. But nobody moved. The security team stood by the doors, their arms crossed their faces, impassive. Marcus, the head of security, did not even blink. He looked at Preston with a boredom that was more insulting than hatred. The guests held their breath, waiting for violence, waiting for the inevitable clash. But the only thing moving in the room was Darius. He stepped away from the table. He walked into the center aisle. He was not leaving. He was advancing. And as he moved, the air in the room seemed to bend around him, recognizing a power that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with authority. Preston gripped the podium, his knuckles white, watching the man he called a bricklayer coming for him, and for the first time he realized that walls could fall just as easily as they were built. Preston was still screaming, his face a twisted map of impotent rage. He was shouting for Marcus, shouting for the police, shouting for anyone to validate his crumbling authority. "Security, get him out. I said get him out." But his voice suddenly sounded tinny and small. The reason was simple. The audio feed from his microphone had been cut. Darius had not moved toward the stage. He stood in the center of the aisle, immovable as a monolith, holding his smartphone in his hand. He tapped the screen once. A sharp digital chime echoed through the overhead speakers, the distinct sound of a Bluetooth device syncing with a master system. It was loud, crisp, and authoritative, overriding every other sound in the room. Darius had bypassed the venue's mixing board entirely. He had not just connected to the speakers, he had commandeered them. Preston tapped his microphone furiously, but it was dead. He looked around in confusion, realizing the ambient hum of the room had shifted. The power source was no longer on stage. It was in the hand of the man standing in wet work boots on the white carpet. Darius did not raise the phone to his ear. He held it in front of him like a remote control. He pressed a contact name. The sound of a ringtone blasted through the surround sound system. It was a deep, heavy trill that vibrated in the chests of the guests. Ring, ring. The entire room held its breath. The tension was so thick it felt physical. Preston stood frozen, his mouth agape, realizing his own technology had turned against him. The ringing stopped. The line connected with a soft click that thundered like a gavel strike. Simon, the CEO of the investment bank, answered. His voice was no longer frantic. It was hushed, terrified, and trembling with a reverence that bordered on religious. "Hello," Simon whispered. The clarity of the sound system picked up his shallow breathing. Darius did not say hello. He did not introduce himself. He spoke into the phone with a calm, terrifying familiarity. "Simon, you are on speaker." There was a pause on the other end, a pause filled with the shuffling of papers and the sound of a man trying to stand up straight, even though he was miles away. "Mr. Chairman," Simon stammered. The title rang out, echoing off the glass walls. "Mr. King, is that you?" A collective gasp sucked the air out of the tent. It started at the front tables and rippled backward like a shockwave. "Mr. King." Preston's knees buckled. He grabbed the podium for support, his eyes wide and unseeing. He shook his head slowly, mouthing the word, "No," over and over again. "Yes," Simon Darius replied, his voice calm, flat, and deadly. "I am here. I am standing about 20 feet away from your former vice president. I believe he was under the impression that you were joking about the investigation." "Oh God, no, sir." Simon rushed to speak, his voice pitching up in panic. "Absolutely not, sir. I would never presume. I did not know you were there, sir. If I had known you were attending personally, I would have handled this differently. I am looking at the compliance report right now, Mr. King. We are cooperating fully with your internal team." "My internal team," Darius repeated. "Yes, sir," Simon said. "The team from Onyx Horizon. Your team, Mr. King." The words hung in the air, suspended in the silence. Your team. I looked at my husband. I looked at the man who had fixed my sink, who drove a rusted truck, who held me when I cried. And suddenly, the puzzle pieces slammed together with violent force. The confidence, the knowledge, the ghost investor Preston had bragged about. Darius did not just work for Onyx Horizon. He was not just a manager or a director. He was the ghost. He was the money. He was the king. Darius did not break eye contact with Preston. He held the phone steady, his voice remaining flat and devoid of emotion, yet carrying a weight that pressed down on every soul in the room. He needed to remove all doubt. He needed to strip away every layer of Preston's denial until only the raw, ugly truth remained. Simon Darius said, his voice booming through the speakers with crystal clarity. For the benefit of the audience and for the record, please process authorization code Oscar Hotel Alpha Niner Niner. Validate identity and clearance level immediately. The request hung in the air. It was a command code, a sequence of words that sounded like a nuclear launch sequence. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the frantic clatter of a keyboard. Then Simon's voice returned, breathless and trembling with the gravity of the revelation. Processing code, Simon said. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the voice came back louder this time, formally stripped of panic and replaced by terrified obedience. Code recognized. Identity verified. You are Darius King, founder of Onyx Horizon, chairman of the board, majority shareholder. Security clearance level 0. The name hit the room like a physical shockwave. Darius King. The guests gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the tent. Onyx Horizon wasn't just a company, it was an empire. And Darius wasn't just an employee, he was the empire. The ghost investor wasn't a myth. He was the man standing in mud-caked boots in the center aisle wearing a $5 t-shirt. Preston staggered back as if he had been shot. He grabbed the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. His mouth worked soundlessly, his brain unable to reconcile the image of the dirty bricklayer with the titan of industry who owned his future. Bianca dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the floor, shards of crystal exploding outward, but she didn't even blink. She stared at Darius with a look of dawning horror, her mind replaying every insult she had hurled at him in the last hour. Darius ignored them all. He spoke into the phone again, his voice colder than the storm outside. Simon, initiate immediate termination protocol for Preston Vance. Revoke all access. Scrub his credentials from the mainframe. I want him escorted out of the building by federal agents before the hour is up. Understood, Mr. King. Simon replied instantly. I am logging the termination order now, effective immediately. For the file, sir, I need to state the cause. Is it just the compliance breach? Darius looked at Preston. He looked at the arrogance that had turned into fear. He looked at Harold and Joyce, who were trembling in their designer clothes. Then he looked down at me, at the wine stain ruining the dress I had felt so beautiful in. Record the following causes. Darius said, his voice echoing like a judgment from God. Count 1. Embezzlement of corporate funds. Count 2. Bribery of a corporate officer. Count 3. Racketeering. He paused, letting the legal weight of those words sink in. Then his eyes softened just a fraction as he looked at me before turning back to the terrified groom. And count 4, Darius added, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Malicious destruction of personal property. He ruined my wife's dress. And I really liked that dress. Execute it. Done, Simon said. It is done, sir. Darius tapped the screen and the call ended with a sharp click, leaving the room in a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. The heavy glass doors of the pavilion did not just open, they burst outward with a synchronized hydraulic hiss. The storm outside was instantly pushed back by a phalanx of men who entered the room. These were not the rented venue security guards in ill-fitting polyester jackets. These were 12 men in identical bespoke black tactical suits moving with the fluid, deadly precision of a Secret Service detail. Rainwater glistened on their shoulders, but their expressions were stone. Preston, seeing the sudden influx of authority, stumbled forward, his face lighting up with a desperate, delusional hope. Finally, he gasped, reaching out a hand. Officer over here, arrest him. He hacked into the system. He is disrupting the peace. The lead agent did not even glance at Preston. He walked past the groom as if Preston were a piece of furniture, a minor obstacle in the path of a much more important objective. The entire team flowed around Preston, splitting like a river around a rock, and continued their march down the center aisle. The rhythmic thud of their dress shoes on the floor was the only sound in the room. They converged on the center table. In a single seamless motion, they formed a protective perimeter, facing outward, their backs to the table, their eyes scanning the crowd for threats. Then the team leader turned inward. He stopped directly in front of the chair where Darius sat. He snapped his heels together, the sound cracking like a whip, and then he bowed. It was not a nod. It was a full ceremonial 90-degree bow of absolute deference. "Good evening, Mr. King," the agent said, his voice crisp and respectful. "We have secured the perimeter. The extraction team is on standby." Behind the security detail, a younger man walked briskly, carrying a garment bag and a silver tray. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit that whispered old money. He stepped through the line of bodyguards and approached Darius with the reverence of a squire attending a knight. "Sir," the assistant said, offering the tray. "I brought the fresh change of clothes you requested from the car. And the wet wipes." Darius took a hot steamed towel from the tray. He methodically wiped his hands, removing the mud and the residue of the champagne Preston had spilled. He cleaned his face, wiping away the rain and the grit. He dropped the used towel back onto the tray with a heavy, wet thud. The assistant unzipped the garment bag. He produced a jacket. It was not just a blazer. It was a masterpiece of tailoring, a midnight blue Tom Ford dinner jacket, with a shawl collar cut to accommodate Darius's broad shoulders perfectly. The fabric seemed to absorb the light. Darius stood up. He slipped his arms into the jacket. The assistant stepped in to adjust the collar and smooth the lapels. Darius fastened the single button. He adjusted his cuffs, shooting the white linen of his shirt, which the assistant had also provided, in a blur of motion past the sleeve of the jacket. The transformation was visceral. The man who had looked like a rugged laborer just seconds ago vanished. In his place stood a titan. The jacket did not just cover the wet t-shirt, it erased it. It emphasized his height, his power, and his terrifying composure. He pulled a white silk pocket square from the assistant's hand and tucked it into his breast pocket, with a precise, practiced movement. He looked around the room. He was no longer the intruder. He was the owner. He was the gravity that held the room together. He turned to me and offered his hand again, but this time the sleeve was dry, the cufflink glinted gold, and the aura was undeniable. "Ready to go, Mrs. King?" he asked. The entire room stared. Preston slumped against the podium, realizing with sickening clarity that he hadn't just insulted a guest. He had declared war on a god. Darius ascended the short flight of stairs leading to the stage. He did not run, he did not sprint. He moved with a terrifying, unhurried cadence. Each step of his polished dress shoes struck the hollow wooden stage with a heavy rhythmic thud that sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The sound echoed in the dead silence of the room, amplifying the tension until it was nearly unbearable. The stage lights, meant to highlight a celebratory toast, now cast harsh shadows across his face, turning the angles of his jaw into a landscape of granite. Preston, who had been the master of ceremonies just moments ago, now looked like a cornered animal. The arrogance that had fueled him all night had evaporated, leaving behind only a primal, trembling fear. He scrambled backward, his heels catching on the carpeted surface of the platform. He raised his hands as if to ward off a blow, his eyes darting frantically for an exit that didn't exist. Panic seized the groom completely. His hands, slick with cold sweat, fumbled with the microphone he was still clutching. He tried to speak, to beg, to scream, but his fingers lost their grip. The heavy wireless microphone slipped from his grasp, tumbling through the air toward the hard floor. It was a symbol of his loss of control, a final clumsiness to cap off his destruction. But the microphone never hit the ground. With a reflex speed that blurred in the ambient light, Darius reached out. His hand snatched the device out of the air inches before impact. It was a casual dismissal of gravity, a display of physical competence that made Preston's clumsiness look even more pathetic. Darius gripped the microphone firmly and stepped past the cowering groom without even looking at him. He treated Preston not as an enemy, but as an obstacle, a piece of furniture to be walked around. Darius walked to the center of the stage. He stood under the spotlight, the beam illuminating the sharp lines of his Tom Ford tuxedo and the hard, unyielding set of his jaw. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Harold and Joyce frozen near the champagne tower, their mouths hanging open in a rictus of shock. He saw Bianca clutching the edge of a table, her face pale as a sheet. He saw the guests, the bankers, the developers, the socialites, who had laughed at his truck and sneered at his wife. Darius raised the microphone to his lips. He did not need to shout. The sound system carried his voice to every corner of the room, deep, resonant, and cold as the grave. I have been sitting here all night listening. He paused, letting the words sink into the plush carpet, letting them hang over the heads of the guilty. I listened to you talk about value. I listened to you talk about class. I listened to you define a man's worth by the label on his jacket and the emblem on his car hood. You looked at my boots and you saw a laborer. You looked at my hands and you saw dirt. You called me a bricklayer. You called me a loser. You called me the filth that needed to be swept away to keep your little fantasy world pristine. Darius swept his gaze across the front row, making eye contact with the very men who had turned their backs on him earlier. They shrank into their seats, unable to meet his stare. It seems there has been a fundamental error in your assessment, a miscalculation of assets. So allow me to reintroduce myself properly. He took a step forward, his shadow stretching out over the crowd like a dark wing. My name is Darius King. I am the founder and executive chairman of Onyx Horizon. You pride yourselves on working for the biggest banks in Atlanta. I own the holding companies that own your banks. You brag about your million-dollar real estate developments. I am the one who approves the financing. You laughed at me for being poor, but right now I suggest you check your own liquidity. A collective gasp ripped through the room. The name King hung in the air like smoke. I sign the paychecks for half the people in this room, Darius said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was louder than a scream. I hold the debt for the other half. And looking around at this display of character tonight, I have to say, I am extremely disappointed in my investments. Darius turned his back on the silent, stunned audience. He did not care about their shock or their sudden, desperate reassessments of his worth. He pivoted slowly on his heel, directing his entire imposing focus toward the man trembling at the edge of the stage. Preston stood there, the medals on his rental tuxedo jingling faintly with the force of his shivering. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn to ash while he was still locked inside. He opened his mouth, perhaps to plead, perhaps to offer some pathetic excuse about a misunderstanding, but Darius raised a single hand. It was a sharp, commanding gesture that sliced through the air and silenced the groom instantly. Darius took 2 deliberate steps, closing the distance until he loomed over the smaller man. He did not need to be physically aggressive. His mere presence was a suffocating weight that sucked the air out of Preston's lungs. Darius held the microphone casually at his side, but his eyes were locked on Preston's face, dissecting him with the cold, unfeeling precision of a coroner examining a corpse. You are standing there calculating. Darius said, his voice low and intimate, yet amplified enough for every person in the glass tent to hear the verdict clearly. You are worrying about your job. You are thinking about how you will explain being fired to your friends. You are telling yourself that you can just move to another firm. Maybe go to New York. Maybe Chicago. Start over where nobody knows you. Darius shook his head slowly, a gesture of mock pity that cut deeper than a knife. You are not grasping the magnitude of your situation, Preston. You are not just terminated from Onyx Horizon. 3 minutes ago, my legal team transmitted your full personnel file to the Global Compliance Database. Your name, your social security number, your biometric data, it has all been uploaded to the exclusion list. Preston let out a strangled sob, his eyes widening until they showed white all around. He knew what that list meant. It was the death sentence of the financial world. That list is shared by every major investment bank, hedge fund, and private equity firm in North America and Europe. Darius continued, his tone relentless and devoid of mercy. Goldman, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, they all just received a notification that you are a confirmed liability, a financial predator, a thief. You are not just unemployed, you are blacklisted. Darius leaned in closer, invading Preston's personal space to deliver the final blow with brutal clarity. You will never trade a stock again. You will never manage a portfolio again. You will never step foot on a trading floor again. You are radioactive. You could not get hired as a night security guard at a local credit union because you would fail the background check before you even finished filling out the application. Your career is not just over. It never existed. I have erased you. The reality of the sentence hit Preston with the force of a physical blow. The adrenaline that had been propping him up vanished, leaving nothing but a hollow, crushing despair. His legs gave way completely. He did not sit. He collapsed. He hit the wooden floor of the stage with a heavy, pathetic thud, his knees buckling under the weight of his ruined life. He crumpled into a ball at Darius's feet, clutching the hem of Darius's trousers like a beggar pleading for scraps. A raw, guttural wail ripped from his throat. It was the sound of total devastation. He sobbed openly, loud, ugly, heaving cries that echoed through the silent room. Snot and tears streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat and expensive makeup, creating a mask of absolute misery. He was no longer the arrogant vice president. He was a broken child weeping in the shadow of the man he had tried to destroy. The guests looked away, unable to watch the complete disintegration of a human being's dignity. Darius looked down at the weeping figure, his expression unchanged. He felt no pity. He only felt the cold satisfaction of justice served. The sobbing at Darius's feet eventually subsided into jagged, wet gasps for air. Preston lay in a heap, a ruin of a man. But Darius was not finished. He had stripped Preston of his career and his reputation. But there was one final debt that needed to be settled, a debt to the law. Darius took a half-step back, his boot landing inches from a small, dark object lying on the pristine white carpet. It was the matte black titanium card Preston had thrown down with such arrogance only 20 minutes earlier. It glinted under the stage lights, a silent piece of evidence screaming for attention. "Look at it," Darius commanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a gravity that forced Preston to lift his tear-streaked face. "Look at the instrument of your destruction." Preston stared blankly at the card, his eyes unfocused. "You told everyone here that this was a perk," Darius said, his tone clinical, dissecting the lie. "You told them Onyx Horizon was paying for the party. You were half right. My company is paying for it. But not because we offered. We are paying for it because you stole it." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. The guests who had been paralyzed by shock began to exchange nervous glances. They were realizing that the champagne they were drinking and the food they had eaten were technically stolen goods. "I just received the transaction log from the finance department." Darius continued, pulling his phone out and scrolling through a document without looking away from Preston. "Venue rental, catering, the band, the flowers, the open bar. The total comes to just over $200,000. All charged to a Vanguard Tech restricted infrastructure account in the last 48 hours. Darius crouched down, bringing his face level with Preston's. The proximity was terrifying. "That money does not belong to you, Preston. It belongs to the shareholders. It belongs to the pension funds and the retirees who invest in my company. You took their money and you spent it on a vanity project to impress people who do not even like you." Darius stood up, towering over the groom once more. He gestured to the glass walls of the tent, to the opulent waste surrounding them. "There is a specific legal term for what you have done. It is not misappropriation, and it is not an accounting error. When you cross state lines with electronic funds that do not belong to you, it is called federal embezzlement." Preston shook his head weakly, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. I was going to pay it back. It was just a loan, I swear. The intent to repay is not a defense against theft, Darius replied cold and final. You committed a felony, Preston, and you did it in front of 200 witnesses. As if on cue, a sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the tent. It started as a low drone barely audible over the rain, but it grew rapidly in intensity. Woo up, woo up. The sound of sirens. They were not distant city noises. They were close. Aggressive, getting louder by the second. Blue and red lights began to flash against the wet exterior of the glass tent, painting the terrified guests in strobing colors of emergency. The wail of the sirens rose to a deafening crescendo, signaling the end of the party and the beginning of a very long nightmare for Preston Vance. The law had arrived, and it was coming for the man on the floor. The red and blue strobe lights from the patrol cars outside washed over the interior of the glass tent, turning the terrified faces of the guests into a flashing mosaic of panic. The heavy double doors were thrown open, banging violently against the walls. This was not a polite entrance. A squad of uniformed officers flanked by federal agents in windbreakers stormed into the venue. They moved with a grim efficiency that shattered the last illusions of a high society event. The air, once smelling of expensive perfume, now reeked of rain and impending incarceration. The lead agent marched straight to the stage where Preston lay curled in a fetal ball. He did not offer the groom a hand up. He grabbed Preston by the collar of his sweat-stained tuxedo and hauled him to his feet with zero ceremony. Preston's legs dragged uselessly. He was limp, a puppet whose strings had been cut. "Preston Vance," the agent barked, his voice cutting through the din. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The metallic rasp of handcuffs ratcheting tight around Preston's wrists echoed across the room. It was a sound of finality. The guests watched in horrified fascination as the man who had bragged about being a kingmaker was frog-marched down the stairs, head bowed in shame. But the drama was not over. Another detective turned his attention to Bianca. She was standing near the cake table, clutching her left hand to her chest, her eyes darting around like a trapped bird. She wasn't looking at her husband being dragged away. She was looking at the diamond on her finger. "Ma'am," the detective said, stepping into her path, "I need the ring." Bianca shrieked a high-pitched sound of pure entitlement. "No, you cannot take it. It is mine. He gave it to me. It is my engagement ring." "It was purchased with stolen corporate funds," the detective replied, his voice flat and uncompromising. "It is evidence in a federal investigation. Hand it over or I will add obstruction of justice to your family's list of problems." Bianca scrambled backward, trying to twist the ring off her finger to hide it, or perhaps to swallow it, anything to keep the symbol of her status. But her hands were shaking too badly. She tripped over the train of her voluminous designer gown. Her high heel caught on the hem and she lost her balance completely. She went down hard. There was a sickening splash. Bianca landed directly in the center of the aisle, right where Darius had walked earlier. She fell into the mixture of spilled champagne cake icing and the thick red Georgia clay that had been tracked in by Darius's boots. The pristine white silk of her dress acted like a sponge, instantly soaking up the brown sludge and the sticky alcohol. She tried to push herself up, but her hands slipped in the muck, sending her sprawling back down onto her face. When she finally lifted her head, she was unrecognizable. Her hair was matted with mud. Her face was smeared with gray slime. Her dress was a ruined, sodden catastrophe. I watched from the doorway, safe under Darius's arm. The image burned into my mind. Bianca, who had sneered at my wet clothes, who had called me dirty, was now groveling in the filth. The universe had not just balanced the scales, it had smashed them. She sat there in the wreckage of her vanity, weeping not for her husband, but for her dress, and her diamond looking exactly like the trash she had accused me of being. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the glass walls, casting a rhythmic, sickly pallor over the wedding guests. While Preston was being shoved into the back of a squad car outside, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding inside near the exit. Harold stood frozen, staring down at his phone. It had vibrated in his pocket, a singular notification that carried more weight than the handcuffs clicking onto Preston's wrists. He read the message once, then twice. His face went from pale to the color of ash. Notice of asset seizure. Department of Justice. Primary residence sealed. It was over. The gamble, the mortgage, the house he had lived in for 30 years. The legacy he thought he was protecting. It was all gone. Seized as collateral for a criminal enterprise he had eagerly funded. Panic, raw and animalistic, hijacked his brain. He looked up and saw Darius walking toward the door, his arm around Zara, moving with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train leaving a station. Darius was the only liquidity left in the room. He was the only man with the power to make the phone call that could stop the bulldozers. Harold moved. He did not walk with the dignified stride of a patriarch. He scrambled. He ran across the wet-stained carpet, his expensive shoes slipping on cake and mud. He looked deranged, his bow tie askew, his eyes wide with terror. "Darius!" Harold screamed, his voice cracking. "Darius, wait!" He lunged toward his son-in-law, his hands reaching out, fingers hooked like claws, desperate to grab onto something solid. He aimed for the hem of Darius's trousers, for his arm, for anything he could hold on to beg for salvation. "Son-in-law," Harold gasped, breathless, as he closed the distance. "Please, you have to listen to me." He never made contact. Before Harold could get within 3 feet of Darius, a wall of black fabric materialized in front of him. The head of Darius's security detail stepped in with lethal speed. He did not strike Harold. He simply placed a heavy, immovable hand on the center of the older man's chest and stiffened his arm. Harold collided with the hand and stopped dead. The momentum knocked the wind out of him. He flailed, trying to reach around the bodyguard, trying to catch Darius's eye. "Darius!" Harold wailed, tears streaming down his face now. "I did not know. I swear on my life. I did not know I was tricked. Preston lied to me. He told me it was a sure thing. He told me it was legal." Darius stopped walking. He did not turn around completely. He just paused, listening to the desperate revision of history. "You have to save me," Harold pleaded, sinking toward his knees as the bodyguard held him back. "I mortgaged the house. I mortgaged everything. They just texted me. They are sealing the doors. Your mother-in-law and I will be on the street. We will be homeless. Darius, have mercy. We are family. You cannot let this happen to family." The word family hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Harold used it like a shield, unaware that he had spent the last 5 years using it like a sword to cut Darius down. Darius slowly turned his head. He looked over the shoulder of his bodyguard. He looked at the man who was currently banned from touching him. His eyes were not angry. They were simply empty of any recognition. He looked at Harold the way a stranger looks at a beggar on a subway platform, with a distant, detached pity. "Preston did not trick you, Harold," Darius said, his voice calm and carrying over the sound of the rain. "He just told you what you wanted to hear, and you were so greedy for status that you didn't bother to ask where the money was coming from." Darius signaled the bodyguard with a small nod. "Let him go," Darius ordered. "He is not a threat. He is just a bad investment." The bodyguard stepped back, releasing Harold. The older man slumped forward, gasping for air, reaching out one last time. But Darius had already turned away, walking out into the night, leaving the man who sold his home for a lie to face the consequences alone. Harold had failed. His frantic plea had bounced off the wall of security like a bird hitting a window pane. But where Harold saw a dead end, Joyce saw an opening. She was a woman who had survived in high society not by strength, but by manipulation, and she knew that while Darius was made of iron, her daughter was made of flesh and blood. Zara had always been the soft one, the one who forgave, the one who desperately wanted her mother's approval. Joyce pivoted away from her defeated husband. She did not run to Darius. Instead, she fixed her teary gaze on Zara. She moved with a theatrical, desperate speed, rushing past the security guard who had stopped Harold, banking on the fact that they wouldn't tackle a middle-aged woman in a cocktail dress. She reached Zara and did something she had never done in Zara's entire life. She dropped to her knees. It was a calculated, dramatic collapse. Her knees hit the wet-stained carpet with a thud that was meant to evoke sympathy. She grabbed Zara's hand, clutching it with both of hers, pressing it against her tear-stained cheek. The mascara ran down her face in black rivulets, making her look like a tragic figure from a bad opera. "Zara, my baby, my sweet girl," Joyce wailed, her voice pitching up into a frequency designed to shatter resolve. "Don't listen to him. Don't listen to your father. He is a fool." Zara stopped. She looked down at the woman kneeling in the mud. For years, this woman had been a giant in Zara's mind, a terrifying arbiter of taste and worth. Now she looked small, pathetic. "I love you the most, Zara," Joyce sobbed, looking up with wide, pleading eyes. "You have to understand. A mother knows best. I was so hard on you. I was so cruel. But it was only because I wanted you to be tough. The world is a hard place, darling. I was trying to prepare you. I wanted to make you stronger. It was all for you. I did it for your own good." The lies spilled out of her mouth, slippery and desperate. She squeezed Zara's hand tighter, trying to transmit a lifetime of affection that had never existed. "Tell Darius," Joyce begged, shifting her gaze to the billionaire standing like a sentinel beside her daughter. "Tell him to call the bank. Tell him to stop the seizure. We are your parents, Zara. You cannot let us sleep on the street. We raised you. We fed you. You owe us this much." The silence that followed was heavy. The rain hammered against the glass roof, filling the space between the mother on the ground and the daughter standing tall. Zara slowly pulled her hand away. She didn't yank it. She simply withdrew it, breaking the connection as if she were unplugging a machine. She looked at her hand where her mother's tears and makeup had left a smear, and then she looked back at Joyce. There was no anger in Zara's eyes. There were no tears. The heartbreak that had defined her relationship with her mother for 20 years had evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. "You are confused, Joyce," Zara said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the trembling fear that usually defined their conversations. "Zara, please," Joyce whimpered. "You called me trash 45 minutes ago." Zara stated the facts, landing like stones. "You stood right there by the champagne tower, laughed with your friends, and called me garbage. You said I was an embarrassment." Zara took a step back, moving closer to Darius. She looked down at her mother with a look of absolute, crushing indifference. "Trash does not have a mother," Zara said, her voice cold and final. "And trash certainly does not have the money to save you." She turned her head away, looking out into the dark, rainy night. "Goodbye, Joyce." The rejection from his daughter left Harold standing in a stunned silence, but Darius was not quite finished. He had one final ledger to balance before he walked out of their lives forever. He paused at the threshold of the glass doors, the storm outside raging against the transparent walls. He turned his head slightly, not fully facing the man who had tormented him for years, but giving him enough of a profile to deliver the final strike. "There is one last detail, Harold," Darius said. His voice cut through the sound of the rain like a razor. "You mentioned your mortgage. You said the bank had frozen your assets." Harold looked up, a flicker of pathetic hope igniting in his eyes. He thought for a split second that Darius was offering a lifeline, that perhaps there was a negotiation to be made. "Yes," Harold gasped, stepping forward. "Yes, Darius. They froze it all. But you can fix it. You own the banks. You can unfreeze it." Darius let out a short, humorless breath. It was a sound of disbelief at the man's density. "You misunderstand the situation entirely," Darius corrected him, his tone clinical and detached. "When the Department of Justice flagged your accounts for suspicious activity linked to Preston's fraud, the bank panicked. They categorized your loans as toxic assets. They looked to offload the risk immediately." Darius tapped the side of his phone, which he was now sliding into his jacket pocket. My distressed asset fund has an algorithm for situations exactly like this. We buy high-risk debt from major banks at a discount. The transaction cleared while your wife was screaming at Zara. Harold's knees began to shake again. The hope in his eyes was replaced by a dawn of absolute horror. I am not here to unfreeze your accounts, Harold, Darius said, delivering the words with the force of a sledgehammer. I am your new creditor. I own your mortgage. I own your car loans. I own the credit card debt you racked up trying to look rich for this wedding. Harold opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was drowning in open air. And as the new owner of the note, I have made a business decision. Darius continued, his voice devoid of mercy. I am calling in the loan, effective immediately. I am initiating foreclosure proceedings on the property. Foreclosure. Harold whispered the word, tasting like bile. You have 24 hours, Darius stated. He checked his watch, a gesture of casual dominance. By this time tomorrow, the locks will be changed. Anything left inside the house will be considered abandoned property and will be auctioned off to recoup a fraction of what you owe me. 24 hours, Joyce shrieked from the floor, finding her voice again. You cannot do that. It is illegal. We have rights. Read the fine print of your mortgage agreement, Joyce, Darius replied, finally stepping out into the cool, cleansing rain. There is a clause for criminal negligence. You are lucky I am giving you a full day. I usually only give 12 hours. Darius placed a protective hand on Zara's back. He did not look back at the ruin he left behind. He did not look back at the wailing in-laws or the arrested groom. He simply walked forward, guiding his wife toward the waiting line of black SUVs, leaving the wreckage of the past to rot in the mud. The cool night air hit Zara's face, washing away the stifling heat of the glass tent. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, tapping rhythmically against the black umbrellas held by Darius's security team. Darius guided her toward the waiting convoy of SUVs, but just as they reached the edge of the paved walkway, Zara stopped. She planted her feet firmly. She pulled her hand gently from Darius's grip. Wait, Zara said softly. There is one last thing. She turned away from the cars and looked toward a patch of churned earth near the entrance of the tent. It was the spot where hours ago, Preston had snatched the heirloom hairpin from her hair and tossed it into the mud like garbage. That pin had been the only thing of value. She owned, a silver artifact from her grandmother, the only woman in the family who had ever loved her. Zara stepped off the clean pavement. Her heels sank into the wet soil. She did not care. She scanned the ground, her eyes searching the muck until she saw a faint glint of metal. She crouched down, ignoring the mud that stained the hem of her dress, and plucked the object from the dirt. She wiped it on her palm, smearing the grime to reveal the dull silver beneath. Zara. The shriek came from the tent entrance. Bianca stumbled out into the rain. She was a wretched sight. The once pristine bride was now a portrait of disaster, her dress brown with sludge, her mascara running in black rivers down her face. She ran toward Zara, slipping on the wet grass, desperation clawing at her throat. Zara, you cannot leave me, Bianca wailed, grabbing at Zara's arm with frantic hands. They are going to take the ring. They are going to freeze my accounts too. You have to tell Darius to stop them. We are sisters. You promised Grandma you would always look out for me. Zara stood slowly. She held the hairpin tightly in her hand. She looked at the sister who had never been a sister, only a bully. She looked at the woman who had used that very promise to manipulate and abuse her for years. I remember the promise, Zara said. Her voice was steady, cutting through Bianca's hysterics. I promised Grandma I would protect you. I promised I would be the bigger person. I endured your insults. I endured your greed. I endured your cruelty because I thought that is what family did. Bianca sobbed, nodding eagerly. Yes, yes. So help me fix this. Zara looked down at the hairpin in her hand. It was bent. It was covered in filth. It was no longer a treasure. It was just a piece of metal that had been thrown in the dirt. Zara reached out and shoved the hairpin into Bianca's chest. Bianca fumbled, catching the muddy object against the white silk of her ruined bodice. "Take it," Zara said, her voice cold and final. Bianca blinked, confusing, clouding her panic. "What?" "It fits you," Zara said, stepping back to stand beside her husband. "Look at it. It is twisted. It is covered in mud. And it is completely worthless. Just like you." Zara looked at the sister she was leaving behind, feeling a massive weight lift from her shoulders. The obligation was gone. The bond was severed. "My promise to Grandma is fulfilled," Zara declared. "I protected you until you threw me away. Now you can keep the wreckage." Without another word, Zara turned and took Darius's hand. She stepped into the warmth of the waiting car, leaving Bianca standing alone in the rain, clutching a piece of dirty metal as the police sirens wailed in the distance. As they walked away from the glass tent, the heavens seemed to acknowledge that the judgment was complete. The torrential rain that had hammered down all evening suddenly ceased, replaced by a crisp, clean silence. The clouds parted just enough to let the moonlight filter through, illuminating the wet pavement. Darius kept his arm wrapped firmly around Zara's shoulders. It was not just a gesture of affection, it was a shield. He was physically guiding her out of her past and into her future. They did not look back at the chaos erupting behind them. They moved with the synchronized rhythm of two people who were finally on the same path. They reached the main driveway where the valet stand had been abandoned by the fleeing staff. Zara instinctively looked toward the far corner of the lot, expecting to see Darius's battered, rusted pickup truck. The truck that Preston had mocked. The truck that her mother had sneered at. But the truck was gone. In its place, parked directly in front of the entrance like a land yacht dropped from the sky, sat a vehicle that commanded immediate reverence, a Rolls-Royce Phantom. It was painted a deep midnight blue that looked black in the night, its chrome grille gleaming like the teeth of a beast. The Spirit of Ecstasy ornament on the hood stood proud and defiant. The headlights cut through the lingering mist, two beams of pure white light that turned the muddy driveway into a runway. It was a machine of absolute power, a rolling fortress that made the least sports cars in the lot look like cheap toys. A uniformed driver stood by the rear passenger door. He was not a venue valet. He was private staff, standing with the posture of a palace guard. As Darius and Zara approached, the driver snapped to attention and opened the rear suicide door. The interior was not a car, it was a sanctuary. Cream-colored leather, thick lamb's wool floor mats, and the soft glow of the starlight headliner beckoned them. Darius stepped back, offering his hand to help Zara inside. He treated her not like a rescued victim, but like a queen ascending her throne. She stepped onto the plush carpet, leaving the mud of her sister's wedding forever on the asphalt outside. She sank into the seat, the smell of rich leather replacing the stench of rain and desperation. Before Darius climbed in beside her, the ambient noise from the tent drifted toward them one last time. It was a cacophony of misery. Through the open door, the sounds of the perfect family destroying itself were audible. Harold was screaming at Joyce about the mortgage, blaming her for the expenses. Joyce was shrieking at the police, trying to physically fight a female officer. Bianca was wailing on the ground, clutching the dirty hairpin. They were turning on each other like rats in a sinking ship, clawing and biting in a desperate attempt to survive the drowning. It was ugly, raw, and pathetic. It was the true face of the dynasty they had tried so hard to project, finally stripped of its mask. Darius slid into the seat next to Zara. The heavy door pulled shut with a satisfying vacuum-sealed thud. Instantly, the noise of the outside world vanished. The screaming, the sirens, the accusations, it was all silenced by 2 inches of bulletproof glass and engineering perfection. Peace descended upon them. Darius reached out and took Zara's hand, squeezing it gently. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply signaled the driver. The V12 engine whispered to life, a sound of immense restrained power. The massive car glided forward, crushing the gravel beneath its tires without a shudder. As they pulled away, the red and blue lights of the police cars reflected in the rearview mirror, fading smaller and smaller until they were nothing but a bad memory disappearing into the dark. The camera flashes were relentless, a staccato rhythm of white light that filled the cavernous, high-ceilinged atrium of the new gallery. 1 month had passed since the storm washed away the facade of the Vance family, and the woman standing in the center of the room bore no resemblance to the victim she had been that night. Zara stood tall, wearing a structured cream blazer that looked like armor made of silk. She was not holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres or hiding in the corner. She was holding a pair of ceremonial golden scissors, and the entire city of Atlanta was watching her. Darius stood half a step behind her, a silent pillar of support. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. He wasn't there to overshadow her. He was there to amplify her. He looked at his wife with a pride that was palpable, ignoring the dignitaries and the billionaires vying for his attention. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution thrust a microphone forward, breathless with admiration. "Mrs. King, this collection is projected to be the most significant modern art opening in the Southeast this decade. How does it feel to finally share your vision with the world?" Zara smiled. It was not the shy, apologetic smile of the past. It was radiant. "It feels like breathing for the first time," she replied, her voice clear and steady. She closed the scissors. The red ribbon parted with a crisp, satisfying sound. Applause erupted, thunderous and adoring, as champagne corks popped in celebration of the new queen of the city. 5 miles away, on the wrong side of the interstate, the applause was nothing more than a tinny, distorted noise coming from a cracked television speaker. The room smelled of stale tobacco mildew and beef flavoring. It was a weekly rate motel, the kind of place where the carpet was sticky, and the neon sign outside buzzed like a dying insect. Harold sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, stirring a cup of lukewarm instant noodles with a flimsy plastic fork. He looked 20 years older. His hair was graying at the roots, undyed and unkempt, and his dress shirt was wrinkled and stained. Joyce sat next to him, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, stripped of her jewelry, her furs, and her dignity. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. Bianca was on the floor, sitting cross-legged amidst a pile of laundry they had been forced to wash in the bathtub. She was watching the small TV screen with a look of manic obsession. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. On the screen, the camera zoomed in on Zara and Darius sharing a toast. They looked invincible. They looked like gods. The chyron at the bottom of the news broadcast scrolled in bold, bright red letters. "The King Empire power couple reshaping Atlanta." The reporter's voice was cheerful and merciless. "Sources say Darius King has just acquired the foreclosed Vance family estate and plans to demolish the main house to build a community art center run by his wife. It is a new dawn for the city." The news hit Bianca like a physical slap. Demolished, her legacy, her home, turned into a shrine for the sister she had tormented. A scream ripped from Bianca's throat, a raw sound of pure, impotent rage. She grabbed the plastic remote control and hurled it with all her strength at the television. It struck the screen with a loud crack, shattering the glass. The image of Zara's smiling face fractured into 1,000 jagged lines before the screen sparked and died. Bianca collapsed onto the dirty carpet, burying her face in her hands, sobbing into the silence of a room that held no future. The screen went black, leaving them in the darkness they deserved. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true class is defined by character, not currency. The Vance family's catastrophic downfall proves that arrogance is a blindfold, causing us to underestimate the quiet power standing right in front of us. While they chase the illusion of status, they fail to recognize that integrity is the only asset that cannot be seized. It teaches us to treat the janitor with the same respect as the CEO, because the tables of life are always turning. Real wealth isn't about what you wear, it's about how you treat others. If you believe that karma always finds a way, hit that like button and subscribe for more satisfying stories of justice.